don't know if this is on or not, but we're going to pretend like it is. Okay, so tell me about the brain stem. What do you remember?
If it gets cut off, you die.
Okay, because it houses, that's exactly right. Because what the medulla oblongata controls what?
All the basic things that breathing, heart rate,
You're saying it exactly right. Vital functions like heart rate, digestion. Stay there. Down. Okay. Yes. Like blood pressure, such as that. Okay, you go here. If I didn't just break it. Oh, that's funny. Okay. Name besides the medulla oblongata. What's something else in the brain stem? The what? The pons. What does it do? Wake and sleep cycles. Very good. Whoa. No, I do not want to do that. All right. What else? Okay. The cerebellum is one. There's one more. Reticular formation. And you know what they do, right? Levels of consciousness and? Exactly right. It activates the sympathetic nervous system. That's right. It also lets you intentionally pay attention to some things while you ignore others, right? Yes. Absolutely. All right. And then the cerebellum, what does it do? Coordinated muscle movement, gracefulness. Right? Gracefulness. The autonomic functions, is that what you're talking about?
like the ones that you can't even control, or it's just man's like breathing. How you can make yourself breathe, and if it normally
I don't know a word for differentiating that from the ones that are totally autonomic. If it happens, it keeps on going while you're sleeping, it's probably autonomic. Okay. All right. The middle layer. Oh, somebody erased my brain up there. What in the second layer we talk about, we call it the limbic system, remember? What are some of the structures there? Thalamus, hypothalamus, hippocampus, olfactory bulbs are not technically, they're actually kind of underneath, but yes, we'll count it in there, that's fine. Amygdala. Okay, look at it. Amygdala. Amygdala. It's pretty much straightforward. I have heard people say amygdala. I think that's a Star Wars character, right? Okay. So, and do you know what they do? And if you don't, make sure that you make a connection there, okay? Which one controls memory? The ability to store things. Hippo what? Campus. If you have a memory like a hippo, you'll remember where the camp is. Hippocampus. Okay? All right? It's a stupid little mnemonic, but stupid little mnemonics can be very effective. This thing has done this all day long, except for when it just cuts off. So if we have trouble with it, we're just going to keep going anyway. I don't know why it wants to act like that. Don't show this message again. Thank you. All right, so you got them. All right, and then we had this part. And we haven't talked about it yet, right? Is that where we are? Okay. There is a picture that I need to get off of my, somebody had it as a Facebook status or something at some point, and I want to find it again and use it on this slide. It's a picture of Dr. Gregory House. Do you know him? Any of you watch that TV show, House? You know, he was a neuroscientist, right? He did a lot of that. Well, a lot of what they did ended up in the neurological system. But he's holding a human brain in his hands, and it says, use it. Okay, that's all it says. Just use it. It's a brain. Well, when you look at that thing, what you're looking at you don't see any of the stuff we've talked about. You don't see the brainstem. You don't see the limbic system. What you see when you look at a brain is actually the cerebral cortex. It covers the part of the brain called the cerebrum. Okay? The cerebrum is everything above the limbic system. All of the stuff that's out there that's covered with the gray covering is the cerebrum. So when you think about a brain, what you're really thinking about is probably the cerebra of the brain. Now the word cortex, you got other parts of your body that are called cortices, but cortices is the actual plural of that. You've got a renal cortex in your kidneys. You've got lots of other possibilities. We're only going to talk about this one. So when I say cortex, this is who I'm talking about. Cortex means the covering or the bark or the rind of something. Okay? So, exactly like an orange, the peeling part, that's where you would find the cortex, is there on the surface, all right? Now, the cerebral cortex, there are too many words there, but basically, it's the outermost covering that's actually part of the brain. Now, there's covering over the cortex that protects it, but it's functionally not nervous system. It's something else. It's connective and protective. The outermost covering of the brain that is active in terms of carrying messages, densely packed neurons. There are trillions of neurons here, responsible for, notice that nothing we've talked about so far actually included thinking at all. We've got retaining information from experience, and we've got responding to stuff, and we've got triggering things like eating or being aware that information is coming in, but we haven't talked about thinking yet. This is where thinking happens, out here on the surface, in the cerebrum, the covering of the cerebrum. Also, this is where sensory information is completely taken in and understood. And that's going to get important in Chapter 3, which we'll be doing a little bit of today, and then we'll finish it on Monday. Okay, so the cortex. If you've ever seen a picture of a brain, or you've seen a brain, then you know that it's wrinkled. The reason that and that's called corticalization. It's important because the reason that it is wrinkled is because you can get the same amount of surface area in a smaller container if that area is wrinkled. If I've got a flat piece of paper like this, okay, if I were to have to smoothly put it over something kind of rounded, that object would have to be fairly large. If I can just wad it up, I can get that sheet of paper and hold it in my fist. It takes up less room. That's what corticalization is for. Allows a larger space, surface area to fit into a compact place, your skull. And there's some real good reasons for that. Hydraulically, the engineering is just a whole lot better in a smaller, more compact space. It takes less food energy. Many reasons why that's a good thing. And also, the closer together those cells are, the more interactivity they can have, okay, the more they can communicate. And communication is what this thing's all about. So, all right, corticalization, the wrinkling, and the reason for it, get a same amount of surface area in a small space. Okay? Now, the cerebra, you've got two sides of your cerebrum. When we think of them, there's a deep line right down the center called the central fissure, F-I-S-S-U-R-E, fissure. Each of those two sides we refer to as a hemisphere, half of the sphere that makes up your brain. It's not technically a sphere, it's not really round, but it's close enough. All right. So each one of those big areas is called a hemisphere. On each of those hemispheres, we divide the surface of them, the cortex, into four distinct areas referred to as the lobes of the cortex. Okay? Now we're only going to talk about four. There are 8, right? 4 on each side. But it's kind of like with your hands. We don't have to talk, if we talked about the structure of your hands and we talked about how your ring finger is weaker than the other fingers, we don't have to do it, we don't have to say, and so is your other one, right? Because they both are. Unless there's a difference, we won't talk about it. We'll just say it once. And it's sort of the same thing. You got an opposable thumb on both hands, right? Okay, so you've got 4 lobes of the cortex on each side, the same 4 lobes with some of the same functions. And after we talk about how they're alike, then we're going to talk about some differences, okay? But let's look at the structure here. The 2 sides of the 2 hemispheres of your cerebrum are not physically connected with one another. They're free. They're like this, okay? There's one place where there's sort of a neural bridge between the 2 that allows them to communicate with each other. It's at the very bottom. I'll come back to that in just a moment. And it's called the corpus callosum. Okay, the corpus callosum, located here at the bottom. See, what you're seeing is this is the central fissure. They didn't have to cut this right here. It's already separate from the other side. When you cut this brain apart, though, you start at the corpus callosum, and then you can slice through everything else. There's the brain stem. The limbic structures would be on both of the sides there. There's the cerebellum. Corpus callosum's at the bottom. That's where communication from the left to the right hemisphere occurs. All right. It's a very wide myelinated band of fiber, very quick information exchange, lots and lots of pathways there. All right. Now let's talk about the lobes and what their primary functions. We're going to start now. The names of 2 of the lobes, they'll tell you where they are. The other 2 you have to just remember. This is one of the ones you just have to remember. Okay, the occipital lobe of the brain is located right above your cerebellum. Put your hand on your occipital lobe. It's back here. All right, I want everyone to feel your skull. You feel this little shelf right here? Got a little sticky out part right there? That's right underneath your cerebellum. Just above it, you have a flat spot. Do you feel your flat spot? If your hand is not on your head, you do not feel your flat spot. Do you feel it back there? Most of you have one. All right. There's a part that sticks out the farthest right there. You feel it? That's right over your occipital lobes. One on the left, one on the left and the right. So right there. All right, here's what it does. There's a cheap way to remember this. The occipital lobe, if you look at the word occipital, it has in it all the letters in the word optical. What does optical mean? Has to do with vision. One of the primary functions of the occipital lobes is to let you see. Vision happens here in the farthest back part of your brain, right there. Okay. If it is possible for you, for example, your eyes may work perfectly, but if you have brain damage here, you may lose vision. Okay, depending on exactly where it is, your eyesight may no longer work. Okay. Now, in the part where your optic nerves actually connect, where they send information right straight there through neural impulses, and that's what they activate when you see. That part where that happens is called the primary visual cortex. Around it, in all directions, exists association cortex, visual association cortex. It's where you put visual information together with other stuff. What kind of stuff? Well, if you look at a word written in your book and you can make those letters mean something, you can read it, that happens in the association areas between vision and, if you know what the word sounds like, vision and sound. Vision, sound, and meaning. All of those things are happening in the association areas, but it starts with vision. If I say the word hippopotamus, And you can make a mental image of what a hippopotamus looks like. You've got a picture in there somewhere. That picture is also in the visual association area. Okay? So anything that has to do with sight, that's where it happens, somewhere around the vision area. Okay? Any questions? Your visual field can be thought of as a big circle. All right? Big circle. If you cut it right down the middle, each of your eyes sees a whole big circle, okay? The left side of your visual field, all of the information from both of your eyes from the left side of your visual field goes to the right side of your occipital cortex. From the right side of your visual field, it goes to the left visual cortex. Okay? And that's going to be important later. Are you with me? Got it. Okay. There's crossover. The next lobes, this is the other one you have to memorize. Okay? If you go just above, I had you in the middle of your flat spot there. If you go from the top part of your flat spot right up to where, if you do like I do and you wear your sunglasses on top of your head sometimes, right there, okay, where your sunglasses are sitting, that's just about this area right here, okay, up from here to right in the middle of the top. Those are your parietal lobes, okay, right on the sides right there. So if you wear a little beanie, it would cover up your parietal lobes. The very front slice of the parietal lobes, right there where my glasses are, right there, is the major area that we're going to focus on in the parietal lobes, and it's referred to as the somatosensory cortex. Now, it's got a clue in there as to what that means. Somato, you've heard somatic. I told you that had to do with the body, right? So what do you suppose the somatosensory cortex lets you do? Feel your body. Feel your body. So, and information from the left side of your body is interpreted on the right side, and from the right side of your body is interpreted on the left side of your somatosensory cortex. If I step on your left big toe, you feel that in a very specific part of your somatosensory cortex on the right side of your head. And you don't feel me stepping on your toe till that information reaches that spot. And if that part of you gets activated without somebody touching your toe, you'll still think your toe's being touched. That's how ESB works. That's how we've mapped it. All right? Have you ever heard of phantom limb pain?
Yeah.
What is that?
If someone has a traumatic injury and they lose an arm or a leg, they can still feel a sensation of pain in that limb, even though it's not actually there.
Exactly right. That's exactly right. And the reason that that happens has to do with, first of all, the nerve bundles that are still there that should be going, let's say to the hand, that should be going there. If something stimulates one of those nerve bundles and it takes that information and that part of the brain that was attached to that hand gets activated, you feel the hand. The hand's not there, but you feel it anyway. Okay, that's how that works. So, somatosensory cortex, we've mapped it. We know exactly where different parts of the body are felt in the brain. Okay? It does a little bit more than that. That's going to be the most important thing for us for right now. All right, somatosensory cortex and the parietal lobes. These next two tell you where they are with their names. The next one is the temporal lobes, and they're right there by your temples. Temples, right. The temporal lobes. They're kind of a wedge-shaped area from the front of your head, just behind your jaw, back toward the center of your brain. Right there. Your temporal lobes are right there, conveniently located next to your ears. And this is where auditory information is sensed in the primary auditory cortex, and it's understood in the auditory association cortex. Works very much the same way as the visual association cortex does. And actually where those two things overlap is where those senses overlap. So if you hear a sound and it gives you a visual, you know what the thing looks like that made that without seeing it. Or if you see an object or an animal and you know what they should sound like or what their name is, you know what that sounds like, that information is in those association areas. They trigger one another.
Is that why if you smell something, it can remind you of something you smelled that before?
Yep. It's in a different area, but yes. It's in the association areas, exactly. Okay, any questions about any of this? You got it? Left ear information, about half of it goes to the right side of the brain, not all of it. Hearing doesn't completely cross over like vision does. Okay, so if you're hearing something in your left ear, you're hearing, part of that's going to the left part of your brain, part of it's going to the right. Okay, so it gets information. That's why hearing is something that we respond to a little bit differently. We'll see that in a little bit. And then the last one's real easy. It's called the frontal lobes. Guess where they are? In the front. Right. And the area just in front of your parietal lobes all the way down to your eyebrows. Okay? So from here where my sunglasses were sitting all the way down to just above my eyes, that's frontal lobes, both sides. The very back area of the frontal lobes, right there where they touch the parietal lobes, it's called the motor cortex. And what the motor cortex is responsible for is voluntary muscle movement, skeletal muscle movement, intentional muscle movement. Okay? It's right there next to where you feel your... So if something is crawling on your arm and you feel it, and you move that part of you, feeling and responding by moving, right there near one another in two separate parts of the brain. Okay? They're not identical, but they're real close to each other. So it is possible that a person could have brain damage that made them no longer able to move a body part, but they could still feel it. Or they could no longer feel a body part, but they could still move it. Or there could be brain damage that overlaps. Okay, you could neither feel nor move it if it involved both of those pieces of the cortex. You get this? All right, so if I were to give you on the test something like, Suzette cannot move her left arm, which part of her brain is probably damaged? Okay, the right what? The right frontal lobe, motor cortex. Exactly right. Okay. What about you got stung by a hornet on your left cheek? Where do you feel it? Right parietal lobe in the somatosensory cortex. You got it? Okay, very good. The rest of the frontal lobe is where you are most different from the other creatures. Anything that moves voluntarily that has a cortex, they have a motor cortex just like you. But what they don't generally have is the rest of the whole rest of your frontal lobes are association areas. And they're huge and they're very complicated. And we don't really know how they do what they do. But what we know that they do is control your ability to think like a person. To think like a person. So what you can do with that is solve problems, understand riddles, figure things out, critically think, decision make, control yourself. You don't have to just respond to things like your hormones or to conditioning that has occurred before. You can make voluntary decisions about that and not respond. You can have an emotion and not show it. If you've ever played poker and you're any good at it, you've learned not to be excited when you see your great hand and whatever. So you can do these things. That all happens in your frontal lobes. So does understanding how somebody else feels. Compassion, empathy, that sort of thing seems to be primarily for humans run through the frontal lobes. Right here in the very, very front, called the supraorbital prefrontal cortex, right here. It's the part where you can do higher order math. It's the part where you can write poetry. It's the part where you can work crossword puzzles. Okay, all of that is right here. It's also really important in the ability to use and understand language. We don't know exactly how it's important, but we know that it is. Okay, right here. You can remember it because you know those. Do you remember the V8 commercials where they went, could have had a V8, right? Do y'all remember those? Well, what they're doing is the thinking part, and you may have actually done that when you're thinking really hard. Well, that is actually what's not working right when you're doing that. You're kind of jump starting the part of you where it's not doing its job. All right, are there any questions then about the 4 lobes of the cortex? Where's the cortex? It's not the whole brain, it's the what? Outer covering. Yes, the outer covering, particularly of the top part of the brain. That's the cortex. So when we're talking about the lobes of the cortex, that's where we are. It's out there on the surface. Okay? And you need to know where they are, essentially, and what they primarily do. Okay. Now, I told you we would talk about how they're alike to start with, and we did. Now let's talk about how the 2 hemispheres of your cerebrum are different. We refer to this as lateralization. Things are different on the sides. Your laterals are your sides. Okay? One of the ways that we know what's going on in the brain is through looking at human brain damage, right? Those clinical studies. Some of the information that we have about lateralization came from that as well. The association area, as a reminder, is where you put stuff together. We look at patterns of how brain damage tends to affect people and the kinds of skills that it impairs if it is in a particular place to learn how the brain works. And what we find is that a couple of kinds of damage that produce problems with the ability to use language, either to physically make words come out the way they should. Broca's aphasia. Aphasia is a problem with the ability to speak, actually. Broca's aphasia causes a person who may not have done so before to stutter or have really long pauses or to mispronounce words. Although they may know they're saying them wrong, they can't make them come out correctly. All right, just because this has to do, it's usually in the left frontal lobe in an association area with movement. Okay? The connection between physical motor movement and production of speech happens here. All right, another type of aphasia that's well documented and fairly common is if Wernicke's area is damaged. That's Wernicke. If Wernicke's area is damaged, the person who would still understand, they would have, their hearing is fine, nothing's wrong with their ears. The sensation of sound is still happening, and they can maybe identify different sounds. That's a siren, that's a cat, whatever. But speech sounds don't make sense anymore. They can't listen to what someone says and really understand what they're hearing. Okay? Or it's harder than it used to be. It doesn't make as much sense as it did. Maybe have to use very simple language when they may have had a beautiful vocabulary previously. Now, they can still talk just fine. They can produce speech. They don't stutter necessarily. They don't mispronounce. They don't have those aphasias like Broca. But when you talk to them, they have a hard time taking that information in. Now, what do the 2 of those types of aphasia have in common? Okay, aphasia has to do with speech by definition. What else do they have in common? Where are they? In what way is it similar? They're both on the left. That's correct. So both of these types of aphasia happen when there's damage to the left hemisphere. They're in different lobes of the cortex, but it's both on the left. If you have damage to the right side of the brain, you won't, if your brain is organized like most people's, like over 90% of people's brains are organized just this way. If your brain is among those brains organized this way, if you have damage to the right side of your brain, you will not have an aphasia. It will not affect your language use, your speech, or your taking in of language. But if the damage is on the other side, you may have something called spatial neglect. And spatial neglect happens when there's damage on the right side of the brain, and therefore the person just ignores their left visual field. So it's as though if I were standing here, if I had this, y'all, I would know you were there. I could see you if I look at you, but I wouldn't pay any attention to. If I said, okay, the first one whose hand's in the air, you get 10 extra points, it would always be somebody over here because I would just ignore you. I wouldn't, it was, I would know you were there, but I would ignore you because I'm neglecting that hemisphere. Does that make sense? No? One of the examples in your book is something that I actually saw a person do who had spatial neglect. I was working with a guy in a nursing home who had this type of problem, and at mealtime he was a good eater. He didn't have a picky appetite, but he would eat all the food on the right side of his tray, and he wouldn't touch the left at all. And so the nurse would turn his tray around, and then he'd eat everything on the right side of his tray, which had been on the left before, and he'd clean his plate. But it was as though he didn't want it to begin with. He just left it sitting there. And you could say, well, there's food over there, and he'd look at it and he'd go, oh, yeah. But then he'd ignore it because of this damage. Well, because there's still a left visual field. Whatever's on the left would be ignored.
Well, it's like, a thing like that is like this whole side is covered up basically. They can still look that way. They still have the right visual field.
Each eye has a left and a right visual field. It's not one eye. It's half the visual field. Oh. Uh-huh. See? Yeah. Good question. But does that make sense? Okay. Mm-hmm.
What about left-handed people?
A few left-handed people have their dominance swapped, but very, very few. It's a very small minority.
Like which side uses language and whatnot?
In about maybe less than 2% of left-handed people. So a really, really small, but it's enough that if you're having some kind of issues and you need, say, a surgery of some kind, they do, if you're left-handed, they have to map your dominance and make certain they're not interfering with speech. Yes. Yep. All right. So from this type of study, we've gotten some ideas about how lateralization works, but we can take this a step further in, that's what spatial neglect might look like. If I ask you to draw something and you had it, you might come up with drawings that look sort of like that. And you might know, yeah, there's something wrong with it, but you can't fix it because you just ignore that part of your visual field primarily. The other information that we have about lateralization largely comes from split brain research. Now that sounds horrible. It sounds like we're talking about somebody who got chopped over the head with an axe, right? But it's not. We're talking about someone who has had their corpus callosum severed, cut, sliced. Now, what kind of people would have that done? Well, there actually are people who are born without a corpus callosum. That's a problem. Okay, that can actually cause some issues. But there are some people who have epilepsy in a very, very severe form that can be life-threatening and can also bring about brain damage if it's left untreated. It's pretty rare. Most people who have epilepsy, really their symptoms aren't severe enough to be terribly disruptive to them, and many of them who do have disruptive symptoms can be treated with medication, and the symptoms are under control. But for some very small fraction of people, they can have severe enough problems that they may go into a condition called status epilepticus, where they have seizure after seizure after seizure after seizure, which can be, again, very severely, it can be life-threatening. In that case, with a certain type of seizure activity, they want to contain those seizures to one part of the brain where they started. They don't want them to involve the entire brain. One of the ways to do that is to cut off the communication between the two halves of the brain in the cerebrum. The way to do that is to sever the corpus callosum. If that thing's not there, the electrical information can't make it from one side to the other because there's no neural bridge. Okay? Now, there could be someone in this room who has a severed corpus callosum. We would never know it because in the real world, out here, whenever you get messages to one side of your brain, you get messages to both sides. And I've told you a couple of the reasons for that. One of them is because even when you look at something just with one of your eyes, you're getting messages to both parts of your brain because you've got two halves of your visual field, right? So if you're looking at something and you're looking at it with your whole visual field, half the information goes to the left, half goes to the right. Your whole brain knows what you saw. You see that? Stop writing and answer me. Do you hear me? Okay. Okay. If you hear something, if I tell you something, where does that information go? If I say it just in your left ear, both sides. Half goes to the left, half goes to the right. About. Okay? Actually, a little more crosses, but still, you get information to both sides. If I ask you to point at the right answer to something, and you point at it with one of your arms, that arm's controlled with only one side of your brain, but you see your arm, you can look at where you're pointing, and you get information from your eyes, and you get information both sides. So it's really hard in the real world, outside of the laboratory, to just give messages to one side of the brain. But in the laboratory, we can do all kinds of stuff. And they can build devices by which they can guarantee you're looking at stuff with half of your visual field only, or that you're getting information only from your hand and you're not looking at what your hand is doing. So if I put an object into your left hand, and you couldn't see what the object was, and by feel, I ask you to tell me what you're holding. Okay, if it's in your left hand, where does the information of what you're feeling go in your brain? To the right side. So if I say, okay, and you're holding something you recognize. Suppose you're holding a fork. You know what a fork feels like. You would know, right? But if I ask you to do that, and the information's only going to the right side of your brain, I said, tell me what you're holding, you got no speech over there. You can't do it, right? If you have a split brain. Now, obviously, you could do it just fine, but with a split brain, you couldn't, okay? If you put it in the other hand, you could say it right away, no problem, okay? All right, so what split brain research does is demonstrate lateralization. Another name for lateralization is left-right brain specialization. Okay? Your book shows you some other ways that some of the other types of split brain research, but I'm going to leave you to read about that. The point of it is the same. Regardless of how it's done, it's been done several different ways. We get the same type of information from all of it. Therefore, we're pretty sure that we know what we're talking about with regard to this. So, what we have found out, for example, is that the left side of most people's brains controls language and writing. Now, it doesn't control your ability to hold a pencil and move your hand, but the ability to produce written information. So if I ask you to write down the answer to this question and you can write it, that's language production. It's just a different form. Logical thought, analysis, mathematical abilities up to about algebra. Okay? The more spatial kinds of mathematics tend to either be shared or more on the right. It processes information in a sequence, sequentially. This is where if somebody tells you to show your work, show the steps that you went through, this is the part of your brain that lets you be able to do that in order without leaving stuff out. Now you have to practice that to get good at it, but this is where it happens. And it can speak. The right side of your brain controls emotional expression, Spatial perception. If you can read a map and follow it, and you can kind of figure out, oh gosh, we must be going the wrong way, by looking at a map, that's spatial perception. If you have your hand-eye coordination, that kind of stuff, you know where you need to run to intercept a ball as it's traveling towards you, that's spatial perception. If you know whether you ought to pull out into traffic because you can tell how fast the cars seem to be coming and whether you've got enough time and all that, that's spatial perception. Recognition of faces, patterns, melodies, emotions. Musical ability is largely on the right. Okay? Visual arts, that kind of thing, largely on the right because it's patterns. It processes information globally. What we mean is it likes the overview. It also is where intuition comes from. If you feel like you've just got a hunch about something, you don't know exactly logically how you, but you just have a feeling about it, that's on the right side of your brain. And it can't speak. Okay? So, yes?
What do you mean by it can't speak? As in you can't?
Language doesn't happen on that side. If you lose function on the left, you've lost your language ability. Yeah. It can't speak. All right. So, some of you may have been told at some point in your life you are left-brained or right-brained. And I say, hogwash. Okay? Do you see why I would say such a thing? Because people, I'm verbal. You know, that's what I'm much more verbal than I am artistic. That's for darn sure. But I know if I can pull out in traffic or not. Right? So verbal stuff is left brain. No one being able to drive a car without horrible incident every time is right brain almost entirely. It's patterns, right? So am I left brained or am I right brained? Yeah, and so are you, unless you've got a real serious problem. Okay? Now you may like to do the kinds of tasks that require one more than you like to do the kinds of tasks that require the other, but you can do both things unless you have brain damage. Okay? So somebody tells you, oh, well, you're just right-brained and that's why you act like that. Just tell them, well, I'm working on that. Because you really, ideally, we would use our skills from both sides, and the best way to get able to do that is to do it. Right? And we'll talk more about that when we get to intelligence. It is warm in here, isn't it? I'm sorry. Okay, any questions about anything so far? Excuse me? You can try. Party, I don't think it's connected, but you just can try all you want to. Sure. It might be a placebo effect. We might feel better anyhow, huh? That's all that matters. That's what I'm saying. I think it's a decoration, really. Are y'all all feeling air? Uh-huh. See, here's the key. Sit right here. All right? Yep. All right, so let's talk about the other chemical message system in the body. Controlled by the nervous system, of course. Everything is. Works a little bit differently. A whole lot differently. The chemicals in the nervous system, just little tiny amounts, single particles, little bitty, right into the synapse just between the cells, taken back up and reused. The endocrine glands, on the other hand, this refers to any part of you that produces hormones. And hormones are dumped into your bloodstream and they go everywhere. And they affect your whole self, not just one little nerve. They're everywhere. Right? Uh-huh. Yep. The hormones, now, neurotransmitters work really fast. Okay? Sub-seconds, very, very quickly. Hormones, it takes seconds, minutes, hours, sometimes even years to fully do what they are supposed to do. So let's look at some of the endocrine glands. One of them we've already talked about, the pituitary gland we refer to as the master gland because it in some way controls secretions of all the other endocrine glands. It also is called the master gland because it controls how tall you'll be. It's your overall growth.
Isn't that with your thyroid and stuff? Isn't that what that's part of the...
It helps control your thyroid. Yes, it's the master over all of the other endocrine glands. So if something's wrong here, it can show up in lots of different places. Yes, and sometimes people try to treat the thyroid when the problem really is the trigger.
That's why I'm asking.
Yeah.
My youngest one, she has thyroid. But it also affects the sleeping patterns.
The thyroid does
Her
that.
eating patterns.
Yeah. It's all over the place. But we're about, actually the thyroid is we're two down the road, okay? All right, the pituitary gland, master gland, where is it located? This is not a trick. I've told you already. Pituitary gland, where is it located? Right beside the hypothalamus. Now your hypothalamus is protected by the thickest ring of bone in your skull. It's protected by your nose, your cheekbones, and this ridge all the way around. It's right deep in the middle of your head. If they have to operate on your pituitary gland or on your hypothalamus, they go through either the roof of your mouth or through your nose. It can go through your eye socket. Okay, it's way up in there. So, well protected. Must be important, don't you think? For survival? Yep, pretty much. All right, the next one, the pineal gland, secretes melatonin. Melatonin is important in sleep cycles. So guess where this guy is? Right next to your pons. Right, because what does the pons do? Has to do with your sleep cycles. Yes, indeedy. Okay. Melatonin. Melatonin. All right, the next one, there's your thyroid for you. All right. Thyroid gland. It regulates metabolism. Metabolism has to do with how much energy you burn. Okay, basal metabolism is a measurement of how much you burn just to stay alive. Okay, and then you metabolize in order to release energy from your food. Okay, so this has a lot to do with how quickly you do that. So a person who says that they are overweight because of a gland problem, that's the gland they're blaming right there. Yep. And it can be the culprit. It absolutely can. However, it can also be treated. So if that's the problem, there's treatment available. Not necessarily easy or pleasant, but it can be done.
Although it's different, I'm getting personal, for someone like me because I have to have hormone shots because I also have thyroid problems.
It's another kind of hormone.
So when they check for my thyroid, my hormone glands or my hormones mess with my thyroid testing.
Because thyroid is a hormone.
Well, it
Thyroid.
messes with all my tests, so they always come out normal because I take the hormone shots.
Yep. That's right.
And then I gain weight.
That's right. Because there are other ways you can go about trying to regulate metabolism. We'll talk about those in chapter 9. All right? Okay, so the thyroid gland, if it works too hard, if it works too well, you got too much thyroid hormone, it's really hard for you to gain weight. This messes with your temperature regulation. It messes with hair growth. It messes with oil gland secretions. It messes with mood. Too much thyroid mimics an anxiety problem. Too little thyroid looks like depression. Okay? So sometimes people get treated for those mental conditions, psychological disorders, when the problem is thyroid. So that ought to be checked first before anybody ever starts on medication for anything else. Yes?
So, on the one hand is anxiety, and the other hand is depression?
Yep.
Nice options.
Yeah. Too much or too little. Exactly right. Okay, the next one that we're going to talk about is your pancreas. And It is the endocrine gland that controls the levels of sugar in the blood by its release of insulin. Insulin is a hormone. You see how all this stuff works together?
That's what also causes
Diabetes and hypoglycemia. That's correct. Too much or too little or the wrong kind. That's right. Okay. The next one. Okay. Right, pancreas, insulin. That'll help you. That's all you really need. You got this. All right, the next ones are some of your favorites. The gonads. That's right. Your sex glands. The gonads secrete hormones that regulate sexual development, ability to reproduce, and sexual behavior. Now, in lower animals, they're completely under the control of the gonads. You know, they only mate when these things are doing their thing. People can do all kinds of variety of that. We're under more voluntary control because we have the prefrontal cortex. Yes?
Does that include the mammaries?
No. They're not hormones. Those mammary glands secrete, they lactate, they secrete milk. They're not hormone glands, they're not endocrine glands. Although pituitary has to do with the production of milk to prolactin and oxytocin. We're not going to have time to talk about all of them, but no. All right. The gonads in question are ovaries and testes. And while men have female hormone and women have male hormone in small amounts, relatively speaking, primarily we secrete the hormone that matches our gonads. Okay? Has some control over behavior. Now this next one that I'm going to show you, listen to me before I put it up there. Don't write it down. Too many words. I'll tell you what to write. Here we go. Ready? Look at that. Trust me. I know these things. Okay. The adrenal glands are on your kidneys. Kidneys are here. Right? They're here. The two things I want you, I'll say for you, they have over 30 hormones. They control everything from how saline your urine is, okay, to they are what starts puberty. But the two hormones I want you to write down for the adrenal glands, listen, adrenaline, adrenal glands, adrenaline, you see how that connects. That's easy to remember. The other one is cortisol. The adrenal glands are responsible. Those are two of the hormones that they produce. Excuse me? Cortisol is called the stress hormone. Not cortisone. Okay? You're thinking about anti-itch medicine, right? Yep. All right. Any questions about anything so far? I'll show you my gratuitous naked photos of people. There you go. Now, while you observe, let me ask you this. Occasionally I use analogies when I give tests, right? And you know, an analogy is where you take two things that have some relationship to each other, and I'll be asking you to find two other words or concepts that have the same relationship, right? That's what an analogy is. You've done them before. How about this one? Listen carefully. Neurotransmitter is to nervous system as hormone is to, endocrine system. Okay? Now, if we took those two sets of words, we can put them together in different ways. Okay? Could be nervous system is to endocrine system as neurotransmitter is to blank. What would go there? Hormone, right. Okay, you see how this works? All right. All right, so any questions about Chapter 2?